Hello everyone, my name is Exabu and today we'll talk about surprise Unity of Command 2 Victory in the West campaign and specifically its 5th conference alternative history branch. That's right, we'll decide to exploit the Rhine bridgehead and stepped into the first section of this campaign that actually forced me to restart the entire conference. We'll talk in detail about the battle for Bavaria later. That's the mission that actually caused me to reset the conference, and the immediate reason, as you may have guessed, was the absence of certain abilities in my HQs. And what may surprise you somewhat, it wasn't so much about engineering and all those assault crossing abilities, as about the fact that most of my HQs still couldn't launch set-piece attacks, and that can be crippling in all of these scenarios where the enemy and the objectives are becoming increasingly fortified. So make sure that all of your HQs have that ability, because the Americans and the French don't get it by default, and certainly make sure that the 3rd and the 7th American armies and the 1st French get that skill because they participate in the battle for Bavaria. Beyond that, it may be useful to give the 3rd American Army HQ the full complement of engineering skills because of its critical role in the battle for Bavaria and in other missions. This HQ will tend to participate in missions that involve lots of crazy long-range Rommel-esque attacks, so decking that HQ out is a good idea. Also, it might be a good idea to allow some of your HQs place rearguard tokens on units and perform recon and force. You will face a number of German counterattacks in these missions and onwards, and both of these abilities are invaluable in preventing your own losses and frustrating German attacks at the same time. And even on the offensive, when you're dealing with German tanks, rearguard is a really nice way of protecting your infantry advancing out in the open. Certainly give these upgrades to the 2nd British Army. It might also be helpful for the Canadian 1st Army and the American 9th. Although if you're swimming in prestige, which I wasn't at the beginning of this conference, feel free to give these skills to all of your HQs, because even if they're not critical in many situations, they will probably open up new opportunities, new tactical options. As for the engineering and assault crossing abilities, only go for the pontoon bridges. The assault crossing is only situational and not as critical as the game suggests, at least in this section of the campaign. Alright, enough of the sweeping brushstrokes, let's look into the details of all of the missions. Fortress Holland greets you with a suspiciously small and very suspiciously easy first mission to the 5th conference. But you know what, I appreciate the change in scale. And the first thing you need to do, in addition to obviously pimping out all of your divisions with as many specialist steps as you can, is building a bridge just west of Utrecht and sending all of your tanks in there. Ideally, you should kick the defenders of Utrecht out and repair the proper railway bridge there. In the east, I highly advise you to give as many artillery to your infantry divisions as possible or reasonable and use suppressive fire on the first line of defenders there. They both have rear guards and suppressive fire will render them completely suppressed, potentially making them weaker on the 2nd turn, and then get into those hexes. The breakthrough is coming on turn 2. It's a good idea to kill the unit in the middle and isolate the other 2 infantry divisions in that defensive line, obviously clearing Utrecht because the Germans will bring someone in, and then advancing towards Amsterdam. That tank division is the most trouble you're probably gonna face in this mission. It'll probably hack at least one of your advancing infantry divisions into pieces, but it's still very killable, so focus your tanks on it first, and then split your efforts between taking Amsterdam and Alkmaar and Den Haag. And speaking of this, the card you get at Alkmaar is a naval bombardment one. So if you're like me and you've been hogging that naval bombardment card since Italy, use it right from the start, and dealing with Den Haag is going to be child play. And once Den Haag is yours, the last source of supply for the Germans will be out, and taking Rotterdam and Alkmaar is going to turn into a mop-up operation at that point. The British sector of the push to the Ruhr mission is the most difficult part of it, so let's start with the Americans. First and foremost, you don't need anything in the area south of Liège. All the troops posted there are completely wasted, so move them northwards, behind the road bridge, especially those tank divisions, and if necessary you can even blow that bridge up just to be safe. You will really need those units elsewhere, and your first goal will obviously be Aachen, which should easily crack under your set-piece attacks, opening the space for your tanks to flood through the town and across the river. Let me also point out that most of the heavily fortified infantry units south and east of Aachen are static. You should not expect too much activity from them, and although maintaining a bit of a perimeter around them just in case to protect that railway between Liège and Aachen, your main focus should be to advance across the river and clear the area south of Uerdingen, also blocking the possibility of the Germans moving their troops between the north and the south of the map, and eventually supporting the British push on Uerdingen. Nevertheless, the main focus of the American troops here should be Köln and Bonn. There will be a lot of German mechanized activity in this area, but thankfully for the most part, those divisions are not strong enough to destroy your divisions, so you should gradually grind through them and approach the city. Just remember to hold hexes next to them before you take them, and neither Köln nor Bonn should be of any concern. The same kind of logic applies in the northern British sector of the front, except that the fighting here is much tougher, and your immediate objectives for turn 1 will be A, to kill as many German tanks you see as you can, use all of your air supports in that area of the front, and try to deal as much damage as you can, because if not dead, these divisions, like zombies, will return and ask for more of your flesh. The second objective is to take hexes next to Enschede and Emmerich. The logic here is the same. If you hold a hex next to an objective, you will be able to shuffle your attackers in and out without losing all of their movement points to break through the enemy zone of control, thus allowing you to focus your firepower and take those objectives. The same is absolutely true about the Rhine. You should touch it by the beginning of turn 3. Both Enschede and Rhine are absolutely the most difficult objectives in this mission, and holding the hexes right next to them is absolutely required in being more or less sure and taking them on time. As you can see, the Emmerich defenders are rather weak and will collapse very quickly, and I've actually been able to take that objective on turn 1. And one additional early tip here is that you shouldn't only send out your tanks into that plane to destroy enemy tanks. Well-equipped infantry is quite capable, and it may be instrumental in you reaching Schede and ultimately Rhine in time. However, you will not be able to destroy all of the enemy tanks on turn 1, and your infantry will be relatively vulnerable, which is where the rearguard ability comes into play, and it's extremely useful in both preserving your infantry and stopping any German counterattacks in their tracks. It's worth also pointing out that the 2nd British Army will need rearguard and laser missions, so if you get a chance to actually upgrade that skill, go for it. Alright, once both Enschede and Rhine and Emmerich are yours, most of the German resistance east of the Rhine should be done for, and you will only be left with the defenders of Wesel, and once they're gone, just pushing into Uerdingen, and if there is still time, sending those British tank divisions south to help out the Americans. The Saar-Vosges Offensive can kick your butt, especially when it comes to the objectives in Germany in the east, and really taking them on time. But first, let's look at some of the easier bits. Obviously, your first objective here is Metz, and there is nothing that a couple of well-placed set-piece attacks can't do there. And somewhat unsurprisingly, once your infantry is done with Metz, it should move towards Saarbrücken. The German infantry guarding that river is somewhat somewhat passive, but the AI loves using the bridges around the Saarbrücken hex to shuffle its motorized and tank divisions in and out, so it's a really good idea to take that town quickly, even with some losses, and not have to worry about your flanks in that area. Plus, you may get cheeky and push a tank division through Saarbrücken in the direction of Mainz and Koblenz. Whatever you do there, your more immediate objective is Strasbourg, and you'll have to kill that German tank division guarding the railway. And once again, this is a critical combat. If you sustain a few losses, it's not so bad. Use feint attacks, use your air support. This is the most important and sometimes a bit swingy place where you really need to break through and get as close to Strasbourg by the end of turn 1. It's actually possible to touch Strasbourg by the end of turn 1 if you are very lucky, but the main point is getting as close to that city as possible and taking and guarding those bridges that lead to Strasbourg and Ludwigshafen. The AI absolutely loves blowing them up, and for a good reason. They can slow you down, and any delays here might affect your performance around Ludwigshafen and Mainz. Also, early in the mission, watch out for any German mechanized counterattacks in this area, in the area of the railway, so try to guard their possible routes of approach and ideally inflict some damage on them or destroy them altogether. Alright, in the south it's probably going to be much slower and more frustrating. Don't let your French troops get bogged down in attacking all of those fortified positions. Squeeze your tanks around that fortified town and try to deal as much damage behind it as you can, and then push towards Colmar. The part of the front held by the 7th Army is going to be much more static, but do try to probe the enemy defenses with your set-piece attacks. I've found that the defenders of the town at the northernmost edge of that section of the front is very easy to break through in and send at least one infantry division towards Strasbourg or Colmar, depending on your immediate goals. In later turns, your tanks will almost certainly push through Mulhouse and south of Colmar, and you might end up having to attack Colmar across the river, but just get it done. You can always reinforce your divisions and either capture the current road bridge leading towards Freiburg or build your own. It's actually a reasonably good idea to give your 7th Army HQ additional engineering abilities so that it can, if necessary, build those bridges, especially since that HQ will be critical in tackling the much more difficult Battle for Bavaria scenario. And as for Freiburg itself, I've never found it to be particularly difficult, especially since the deadline is pretty late. And as you engage in all these shenanigans in the southeast, your tanks and some well-equipped infantry should push towards Ludwigshafen. Both Ludwigshafen and Mainz pretty much always end up defended by reasonably strong tank divisions, so having infantry divisions that can pack a punch in a set-piece attacks is critical here. So get them in, keep them supplied, bring those HQs close to business so that they can actually perform those set-piece attacks, and push at least one of your tank divisions towards Koblenz, which I've never seen defended. Any kinds of breakthroughs around Saarbrücken are a good idea. I don't think it's a good idea to make this your main pivot of attack, but harming the German mechanized forces in this area is generally a good idea and will probably make it much easier for you to take Ludwigshafen and Mainz in the end. The Herbstnebel scenario is the first defensive mission you'll encounter in this campaign, which, unlike Moscow 41, for example, doesn't have too many of these. And the first thing I need to tell you is not to trust the briefing, which kind of implies that you're supposed to retreat a little and then push back. It kind of makes sense, you're provided with plenty of reinforcements to absorb the German push, but the poor weather means that it's going to be very difficult to take everything back and then ham and Münster on time. So first, your task will be to give as little ground to the Germans as possible. And your second very related task will be to take Münster on turn 1. Taking the objective itself isn't a particularly difficult task, just make sure you don't use suppressive fire on it to prevent the city from going into ruins too early. And once you kick out the German defenders, occupy it with an elite infantry division that is well equipped for defense. Firefly, artillery, engineers will help you out in Münster because congratulations, you've just created the main pivot of attack for the Germans. This will relieve the pressure on Rhine because it's slightly more difficult to encircle and the AI will push for Münster. That hex just north of it will be critical for your success in this mission because it significantly increases the ability of the AI to take Münster, which means that you need to clear it all the time and then take it back, and this is where your rearguard ability or maybe recon and force ability will come in extremely handy. The Germans can concentrate a lot of firepower in that specific hex, and you can really easily lose your best tank divisions there, and for no good reason, because your main objective there is just to hold the hex and prevent the Germans from very easily crossing the river and then immediately attacking Münster. So if you just retreat with rearguard or take that hex using recon and force, will be more than enough. Also, you should start working on your advance towards Hamm right from the start. The German divisions guarding the hexes north of Dortmund will pretty easily cave in to attacks by strong divisions, and once they're out, feel free to build those bridges and occupy those hexes, because remember, the AI will focus on taking Münster, and all or most of its best units will be pushed to taking the hexes around the city. With the reinforcements you're gonna get in later turns, you'll have plenty of forces to actually squeeze your way in through Dortmund and potentially towards Hamm. By the end of the mission, you will have probably completely secured Münster and will be able to push towards Hamm from the north. And speaking of the rest of the front, in the north, the AI loves to send a Panther to try and cut off the railway line between Enschede and Rhine, so try to exploit those swamps and keep them away from open terrain. The German troops just west of that area are very likely to be experience fodder. And finally, in the American sector of the front, there will be no attempts at crossing the river Düsseldorf, but do maintain a consolidated front east of Wesel. You will be using this area to siphon troops towards Hamm anyway, so it's very unlikely that the Germans will gain any ground or even attack there in the first place. Finally, as a general note, let me just point out that this mission has a lot of potential for you losing craploads of troops. So please be careful about where you leave your precious elite tank divisions at the end of each turn, and try to leave a couple of points for the rearguard ability, because it is pretty much your get out of death free card. Ruhr Assault is actually one of the easiest missions we're going to talk about today, as you are very likely to have a significant superiority over your enemies, especially if you did well in Herbstnebel and did not lose too many of your elite troops. And the general outline of the battle is, I'm sure, obvious to you. Two pincer maneuvers, one from the north, one from the south, enveloping the Ruhr region and taking all of the objectives in the middle. If you're, like me, playing this on hard, I highly recommend you to do this envelopment as quickly as possible. Even though most of the defenders there are green units, they are still well fortified and will pose a formidable obstacle if not completely out of supply. Alright, let's first look at what you're supposed to do on turn 1, and the Southern American section is more critical here because of the Leverkusen and Siegen objectives. First, don't be like me and forget to take them, and second, drop those American paratroopers in the hex right below Leverkusen. Feel free to send a good old saturation strike centered in that hex first, and once the defenders are out, send in your tanks. Your goal here is to get as many tanks as close to Siegen as possible, although sending one division in the direction of Dortmund is a good idea just to block out the supply of the defenders in the center, and make sure to bring good infantry around Leverkusen so that you can comfortably use set-piece attacks to breach their fortifications and take that hex. In the British sector, the obvious move is to use your elite forces to clear the area around Münster. Notice the German tank division with the counter-attack token on it, which is a good signal that you should focus on the infantry and the mechanized divisions first. In any case, your main objective there is to block the railway line between Bielefeld and Dortmund, but there's another slightly less obvious thing that you can do with your British troops, and it's exactly what you're supposed to do in Herbstnebel. Advance towards Dortmund across all of those little rivers. The defenders there once again are not particularly impressive, and you can concentrate heavy artillery, special forces there, and breach that area right from the start, build bridges, take hexes. This is also the perfect area for dropping your British paratroopers. That unfortified hex west of Dortmund is just asking for a paradrop, and if you can suppress some of those defenders there first, even better. In any case, please don't send those British troops to any open area outside the city to block any railways or whatever, because the Germans will just wipe them out. On subsequent turns, with Leverkusen being yours and Dortmund very easily falling to your elite infantry, you will close the Ruhr trap, and the the rest of the mission will turn into an XP farm for your HQs and your units. Have fun. As I mentioned in the intro, Battle for Bavaria is actually the first mission in this campaign that forced me to replay an entire conference, and although the obvious answer for why is the absence of the assault crossing ability in most of my HQs, the real reason was that only the 3rd Army had the set-piece attack ability, and that really crippled my ability to take Mannheim, which actually leads me to the most difficult part of this mission, and it is the initial crossing itself and taking Frankfurt am Main and Mannheim on time. Even though breaking through to the other bank is possible using the assault crossing ability, I preferred to spend a paratrooper card which we got in the Market Garden scenario, i.e. the Polish paratrooper brigade. Drop them in that little forest between Mainz and Mannheim, blast the somewhat weak defenders guarding the bridge, and take that hex. You actually have enough tanks in that area to flood them in for German defenses and advance them towards Frankfurt am Main, and already partially blocking the supply leading to that entire area between Koblenz and Frankfurt. And please don't try and break through in that section of the front. It's not gonna help you a lot, and once you cut their supply off, they'll just die out. The AI is very passive there and is not eager to counterattack. Also, even if your 7th Army has assault crossing ability, I advise against using that ability in the 7th Army's section of the front, i.e. between Mannheim and Karlsruhe. It is very possible, but it will involve your infantry divisions dropping onto plain hexes right next to German tank and motorized divisions, and it's just a recipe for disaster, and it doesn't need to happen. So for the 7th Army, block those bridges along the Rhine, and send your best infantry divisions, i.e. the ones equipped with all of the standard stuff, engineers, special forces, artillery, to take Mannheim. The same is true about your best infantry in the 3rd Army, except these will go to Frankfurt. Finally, the French will very much play the second fiddle in this battle, and after clearing those German defenders around the French troops, I use them to push north towards Karlsruhe and ultimately pivot and take Stuttgart. Don't expect any sweeping maneuvers in this area, but you have plenty of time to take Stuttgart, so make sure you take it. Alright, on turn 3, both Mannheim and Frankfurt am Main need to be taken, and make sure that you have what I call the breach duos right next to each of these towns. In other words, one infantry division that has engineers, artillery and special forces to conduct a set-piece attack on the town, and another division similarly equipped, very well equipped for kicking city defenders out to mop up the defenders and, well, kick them out and take that hex. If you manage to partially surround both the cities by turn 3, you're not gonna have too much trouble dealing with them. Once both of these objectives fall, it's easy riding for you. And by riding, I indeed mean riding on tanks, because you have crap loads of them. So just rush towards all of the objectives in the east of the map. Try to prevent bridges from getting blown up, and the AI will happily blow them up if it can. It's a good idea to send a couple of well-equipped divisions, i.e. the divisions that you use to take Frankfurt, to Kassel, and remember that the pockets between Frankfurt and Koblenz is not really going to try and break out. And obviously send most of your tanks towards Nuremberg. Don't get stuck in Schweinfurt and Würzburg. These enemies are well entrenched, but their supply is very easy to cut off. So move past them towards Nuremberg and München, at which point your supply situation might become difficult, and I found that setting up a big supply hub somewhere in the middle of the area between Würzburg and Frankfurt is generally a good idea and will cover most of where you need to go. And obviously don't forget to move your 3rd Army HQ, which controls most of your tanks, closer to business, because it will almost certainly be that the AI will blow up some bridges, and annoyingly you'll be just 1 hex away from repairing it. Which actually reminds me, don't shy away from increasing the range of your HQs during conferences as well. Bigger missions like this is where this really pays off. Finally, the deadline for taking München is shown as 10 turns. However, note that the length of the mission is only 9 turns. I'm assuming this is a little bit of German deception. Also, make sure that by the beginning of turn 9 you have as many tank divisions close to München as possible, because it's very likely that you'll have to push the city, take some losses, and kick those defenders out, because even though they're green, they have that AT step, and you might just be 1 tank division away from taking that last hex and succeeding in this mission. Good luck. I think the most difficult part about the final Vienna award, what a name, mission is sticking to your goal and not running around like a headless chicken. First, look at the southeastern corner of the map. All you have got is Szombathely, which is relatively the most urgent objective and which you won't have to hold. Actually, if weather is decent enough, you can take it on turn 2 and then get the heck out of that area altogether. Your sole purpose from there on will be to clear that railway leading from Graz to Vienna Neustadt. Obviously, do skirmish with German and Hungarian troops in the southeast, and they can get feisty, be careful with your infantry, but still, stick to the railways and to the hexes next to it. Don't try to hold any ground anywhere else. Kicking those German Jägers out of that railway takes your usual bridge duo tactic, where 1 infantry division does the set-piece attack and the other one mops up and takes the hex. So it's a good idea to get that infantry in the mountains around that railway so that you can keep applying pressure on these Jägers and ultimately kick them out. This will take a couple of turns, and if you have cleared the railway line to Wiener Neustadt by turn 4, you're doing really well, and at that point, the immediate goal is clear. Take all of those Vienna objectives on your side of the river. The problem is that the AI knows very well that you are facing a major river that is difficult to cross and will try to take positions on the other bank, so use any opening you can to set up pontoon bridges. Obviously, setting up bridgeheads on proper bridges is the ideal, but it usually doesn't happen, not in my experience. I've actually seen the AI missing that hex next to the eastern edge of the map, and it might, like many other places, be a nice way to sneak your tanks in. And obviously, having appropriate HQ abilities is necessary. Pontoon bridges are required. Assault crossings, my attitude towards them here is similar to that of roads from Rimini. You need assault crossings only if you've screwed something up and you need to eliminate the problem. Pontoon bridges should be enough in 95% of the cases, especially since the HQ you have is the British 8th Army, which you have been with since the beginning of the campaign. But once you cross the river and successfully consolidate your positions, taking the last Vienna objective, and especially a road to Bohemia, which is not a town or mountain, is not going to be too much of a problem. As an additional note, I must point out that little road that leads to Linz. It's very tempting to send a bunch of troops there and then direct them towards Vienna. This has its advantages because that railway actually feeds a lot of German troops. However, it also means diverting some of your troops from Szombathely today, and the supply situation around Linz is very dire. So in general, I advise against going there, and only go there if you're feeling adventurous and if your HQ can deliver emergency supplies to 4 units every turn. And this is it for today, and next time we'll continue with the 5th conference, except that the next episode of the Cracking series will cover the historic path in the campaign, which is a lot of fun. So please press all of those YouTube mandated buttons first, and see you very, very soon. Cheers.